Hey everybody, it's me again. Let's try to answer some more of your questions. Let's get right into it. Ben asks, in the Articles of Confederation, it states that there was no executive branch of government, but yet they still had an elected president. So my question is, how did they have a president with no executive branch, and what did he do? So Ben's exactly right. In the Articles of Confederation, the first governing document after the Revolutionary War, when the good guys won, the Articles of Confederation had no executive branch, and yet there was a president. So John Hanson was the first president. He was the president of the Confederate Congress. So his job was not like the current day president or even the president that was envisioned in the Constitution. It was a one-year term, and it was largely ceremonial. So he signed a lot of documents and didn't do as much as the current president does today. As a matter of fact, he even wanted to resign, but he loved his country so much he decided to stay on for that full year term. He did accomplish a lot while he was there. Check him out. He's sort of a forgotten piece of American political history. His name again? John Hanson. Let's take another question. Faith asks, how did they enforce any rule or law? I understand that it was somewhat madness, but with no executive branch, how did any state enforce a law? Did people just run around killing each other, or did they get in trouble? How did that work? So let's be clear on what we're talking about here. So first of all, at the national level, there's no executive branch. And as we just mentioned, there is a president, but that is a largely different concept of being a president than what we're talking about now. That doesn't mean that there's no rule of law, right? That doesn't mean that there isn't an enforcement mechanism in some way. But you got to keep in mind the focus here is on the state level. So states had governors, states had state governments, states were running the show. And the new national government was set up so that there would be a national government that would decide on things for the nation, but it would be very difficult to get anything done. And so everything in terms of power, no, I shouldn't say everything, but a lot of that power would revert back to the states. So whether it was killing people, or whether it was taxing, or whether it was putting in a new bridge or whatever, that would be at the state level. And so you would have a governor, you would have the executive branch, but it would be at the state level. So don't be fearful that there was a bunch of people going around killing each other or things like, well, I'm sure there was, but there was a way to enforce the illegality of that at the state level. Let's take another question. Brendan asked, how did they divide power in the Articles of Confederation? Were the Articles the same type of living document that the Constitution was? So keep in mind that when we talk about the U.S. Constitution, we have three branches of government. There are separation of powers going on, so each branch has its own power and authority that has over certain areas, and there are checks and balances. The checks are happening between the different branches to balance the power between them. In the Articles of Confederation, it was a unitary system. There was only the legislative branch, and it was in the Congress, and every state got a vote. And so there were no checks and balances in terms of the way we think of them with the three branches of government that we have today. It was a unicameral system where the legislative branch was going to be doing all the work of the national government. So as we pointed out, there was no executive branch, and there was no judicial branch either. And so these are two things that get added into the Constitution in 1787, where they say, hey, we should have a singular leader who is in charge of executing the laws, and then of course he adds the cabinet into that system, and then of course the judicial branch. The shortest part of the Constitution in terms of the three branches anyway, and they add that in order to have somebody to interpret the law. That third branch of government is added. Didn't exist in the Articles of Confederation. So to answer the question, how did they divide power? they didn't divide power. And if you think of how the Constitution becomes a living document that can change over time because of its interpretation, well, that system doesn't exist either, because you don't have a judicial branch, you don't have a Supreme Court where they're interpreting the law, which is an interesting way to think about it, because then the only way to change the Constitution, of course, is by amending it, right? It can't be decided and interpreted differently by a court, because there is no court. And so you have to amend it. So you got to get buy-in from everybody. So there's a couple more questions answered for you about the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Check out that John Hanson guy. We'll talk soon. Keep studying, keep thinking, keep reading. Shoot me, Yakarni.